Somewhere in the blackness of space, 22,000 miles above the Middle East, a satellite with no name and no markings was doing what it always does: watching, waiting, processing. And on the morning of March 28, 2026, the moment a streak of fire erupted from the Yemeni desert below, it knew exactly what had just happened, and it had already decided what to do about it. Welcome. If you are new here, you just landed on a channel that cuts through the noise and gets to the real story behind the world's most critical military events. Hit that subscribe button and stay with us, because what unfolded over the skies of the Middle East that morning didn't just stop a missile. It announced to every military planner on Earth that the rules of modern warfare have been permanently rewritten. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. This community reaches every corner of the globe, and I love seeing it. The desert fires, first. Deep inside the barren mountain terrain of Yemen, on the morning of March 28, 2026, a Houthi mobile ballistic missile launcher was rolled out of a hardened shelter under cover of pre-dawn darkness. The crew worked quickly and deliberately. They positioned the launcher. They aligned the trajectory toward the northeast. Their target was Israeli soil, over 1,200 miles away. The Houthis had been holding back. Since the Gaza ceasefire in October 2025, they had stayed quiet, watching, threatening, but not acting. But now, with Iran locked in a direct military confrontation with the United States and Israel, Houthi leader Abdulmalik al-Houthi had declared that his group's hands were on the trigger, and that trigger had just been pulled. The missile climbed skyward on a pillar of white fire. The Houthi military media team had already captured the launch on camera, already scripted the headline, already imagined the world watching in fear. They believed that 1,200 miles of desert and ocean was their shield. They believed speed was their weapon. They believed this missile would land before anyone could stop it. Every single one of those beliefs was about to be destroyed. 94 seconds later, above the atmosphere, in the cold silence of space. The eye that never blinks. What the Houthi launch crew did not know, what they could not see, was that the moment that missile ignited, a United States space-based infrared system satellite locked onto it from orbit. This satellite exists for a single purpose: to detect the thermal signatures of ballistic missile launches anywhere on the surface of the Earth. It never sleeps, it never looks away, and it processes what it sees faster than any human brain could begin to comprehend. In less than 1 second after ignition, the satellite had already completed a full spectral analysis of the missile's exhaust plume. It had identified the propellant composition. It had calculated the thrust output of the engine. It had mapped the precise oscillation pattern of the airframe as the weapon clawed its way through the atmosphere. All of this happened before the Houthi launch crew had even finished their post-launch communication. The satellite immediately constructed what military systems call a track file, a real-time three-dimensional model of the threat that updates itself dozens of times every second. That track file was instantly transmitted across the kill web, the vast interconnected architecture of satellites, radars, ships, aircraft, and automated decision systems that the United States military has spent decades building and perfecting. The data hit the Combat Information Center of an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer patrolling the Red Sea in milliseconds. And from that moment forward, the outcome of that Houthi missile's journey was already sealed. The kill web wakes up. Here is what makes this system so difficult to comprehend in conventional military terms. The destroyer that received that satellite data did not need to turn its own radar toward Yemen. It did not need to visually confirm the threat. It did not need to wait for a second opinion. The kill web uses a protocol called launch on remote. The ship can fire an interceptor missile using nothing but satellite-fed data, trusting the network completely before its own sensors have ever touched the target. The vertical launch cells on the destroyer's deck blew open with a sound like a thunderclap. An SM-3 Block IIA interceptor, one of the most advanced anti-ballistic missiles ever built, erupted from the ship in a column of white fire. It cleared the mast in under 1 second. The first stage booster burned out and dropped into the sea. The second stage ignited and drove the weapon higher and higher until it punched through the top of the atmosphere and entered the pure darkness of space. Now the intercept was happening on a battlefield with no air, no gravity interference, and no margin for error. But the kill web wasn't finished talking to its weapon. The interceptor was receiving a continuous fused data stream from 3 simultaneous sources: the destroyer's own SPY-1 radar, a ground-based TPY-2 radar positioned inside Israel, and the ongoing infrared tracking of the original satellite. These 3 data streams were merged into a single composite picture that military engineers call a single undeniable truth. The weapon knew exactly where the Houthi missile was. It knew exactly how fast it was moving, and it knew exactly where it would be 8 seconds from now. The skies fill with fire. While that SM-3 was still climbing through the void of space toward its appointment with the Houthi missile, everything below it was erupting into chaos. Earlier that same morning, Israeli F-35 stealth fighters had executed precision strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities, including the Arak heavy water plant, strikes so surgical that they bypassed hardened air defenses entirely. Iran's response was immediate, furious, and massive. Tehran launched a coordinated barrage of ballistic missiles and armed drones aimed directly at central Israel. These were not symbolic gestures. These were weapons designed to overwhelm, to saturate, to break through. Simultaneously, Hezbollah units positioned along the southern Lebanese border opened fire with over 100 rockets aimed at Israeli cities and towns. The sky above the region was suddenly thick with incoming threats from multiple vectors, multiple altitudes, and multiple directions, all at once. This wasn't coincidence. This was architecture. Military strategists sometimes describe this kind of coordinated barrage as a kinetic denial-of-service attack. Flood the defensive systems with so many simultaneous threats that the logic gates jam, the sensors blur, and something catastrophic slips through the gaps. Iran, the Houthis, and Hezbollah had spent years studying Israeli and American missile defense capabilities. They believed they had found the ceiling, the maximum number of simultaneous threats the system could handle before it broke. What happened next showed them just how badly they had miscalculated. The triage protocol. Nobody talks about. When over 100 missiles and rockets enter a defended airspace at the same moment, the single most important question is not, how do we stop all of them? The most important question is, which ones actually matter? The kill web was built around this exact logic. The moment that barrage entered Israeli airspace, the system activated what defense engineers call the triage protocol. Every single incoming threat was assigned a lethality score in real time. The system asked one cold, calculated question for each object in the sky. Where is this going to land? A Hezbollah rocket projected to impact an empty agricultural field? Ignored. An Iranian drone calculated to splash harmlessly into the Mediterranean? Let it fall. This approach sounds callous, but it is the most brilliantly rational thing any defense system has ever done, because every interceptor missile that gets fired at a harmless target is one less interceptor available for the threat that will actually kill someone. The system then divided the surviving threats into engagement layers with terrifying precision. The SM-3 and THAAD systems took ownership of the high-altitude Iranian ballistic missiles still screaming through the upper atmosphere, the most kinetically lethal category. David's sling interceptors engaged the medium-altitude threats already beginning their terminal descent. Iron Dome batteries handled the shorter-range Hezbollah rockets closing on populated areas. Every layer was being fed real-time targeting data from the American Aegis destroyers sitting in the Red Sea, American warships acting as massive floating sensor platforms for Israeli ground-based systems over 1,000 miles away. The entire region had been woven into a single integrated defense grid, and it held 94 seconds. Back in the silence above the atmosphere, the SM-3's final stage had burned away. What remained was the kinetic kill vehicle, a compact 150-pound object with its own infrared seeker, its own miniature thrusters, and its own onboard guidance computer. No warhead, no explosives. None were needed because at the closing speed this engagement was happening, Mach 13, nearly 10,000 miles per hour combined, raw kinetic energy does the work that explosives never could. The Houthi missile, now at the apex of its arc and beginning its terminal descent toward Israeli territory, attempted a last-second evasive maneuver. It shifted its trajectory, a desperate mechanical twitch designed to throw off any interceptor foolish enough to chase it the old-fashioned way, but the kill web had not been chasing it. It had been predicting it. The system had modeled every possible terminal maneuver in the trajectory envelope before the kill vehicle was even halfway there. The kill vehicle made a final correction burst from its attitude control thrusters, and then impact. The Houthi missile ceased to exist as a functional object. There was no dramatic explosion, no Hollywood fireball visible from the ground below. At those speeds, the physics of the collision simply vaporized the structural integrity of everything it touched. What remained were shards of cold, tumbling metal gradually falling back toward the atmosphere, where they burned into harmless dust somewhere over the Red Sea. From the moment that missile launched in the Yemeni desert to the moment it was erased from existence above the atmosphere, 94 seconds had elapsed. The Houthi team that filmed the launch was already broadcasting it as a victory. They had no idea their weapon was already gone. The web tightens. Offense begins. A defense that only defends is a defense that eventually loses. The designers of the kill web understood this from the beginning. Every missile fired at Israel or at American ships in the Red Sea wasn't just a threat. It was a transmission, a confession, a GPS coordinate gift-wrapped and delivered to the most sophisticated targeting infrastructure ever assembled. As each of Hezbollah's 100-plus rockets climbed into the air and gave away its launch angle, origin point, and trajectory, the kill web was stitching together a high-resolution map of Hezbollah's entire tactical launcher infrastructure in southern Lebanon. By the time the last rocket had been fired, the Americans and Israelis didn't just know where the launchers were, they knew the reload schedules, the crew positions, and the most efficient strike sequence. F-35 stealth fighters were already airborne, navigating the seams in Lebanese radar coverage like ghosts. They struck the launcher positions before reload crews could even begin their work. In Iran, the retaliation was equally precise and equally merciless. F-35Cs circling over the Persian Gulf had received the backtrack coordinates from the one Iranian missile that had managed to slip through the layered defenses and strike a residential building in Ramat Gan, east of Tel Aviv, killing one person and briefly making the saturation strategy look like it had worked. Reports suggest that within minutes, those coordinates were converted into targeting solutions and GBU-53B Stormbreaker smart bombs, weapons equipped with tri-mode seekers capable of seeing through clouds, dust, and smoke, were already gliding silently toward the GPS location of the mobile launcher responsible. The Iranian crew was still conducting their post-launch retreat when the weapon found them. They never heard it coming. The drone war that wasn't the Houthis had studied American military spending patterns carefully. They knew that an SM-2 interceptor missile cost nearly $2 million. They knew their own SAMAD-3 surveillance drones cost roughly $30,000 to manufacture. The math looked beautiful on a whiteboard in Sana'a. Flood the Red Sea with cheap drones, force the US Navy to burn through million-dollar missiles chasing them, and drain the most powerful naval force in history through sheer economic attrition. On paper, it was actually a clever strategy. In practice, it never had a chance. An EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft operating over the Red Sea detected the satellite uplink frequency being used to control an incoming Houthi drone. The Growler didn't fire a single weapon. It simply generated a targeted burst of electronic interference, a digital whisper into the drone's communication link, and spoofed the drone's GPS entirely. The connection between the drone and its operators in Yemen was severed in an instant. The drone, suddenly blind and directionless, fell silently into the Red Sea. The entire defensive action cost approximately the fuel it took to keep the Growler airborne. The Houthi drone program, by contrast, had just lost another $30,000 asset and gained nothing. Meanwhile, an MQ-9 Reaper drone had been circling at altitude over a dry riverbed outside Sana'a, watching a second Houthi ballistic missile being prepared for launch. Fueling operations were underway. The crew was working around the weapon. The Reaper did not wait. A single Hellfire missile struck the fuel truck directly. The secondary explosion that followed was visible for miles. A $15 million weapon system reduced to a burning crater before it ever had the chance to threaten anyone. The kill web was no longer playing defense. It was conducting a simultaneous, multi-theater offensive campaign while simultaneously tracking and intercepting everything the enemy could throw at it. Geography is dead. For all of recorded human history, geography was the great equalizer of warfare. Mountains protected kingdoms that couldn't afford armies. Rivers stopped invaders that couldn't be beaten in open battle. Desert and distance gave the weak a fighting chance against the strong. The Houthi leadership in Yemen built their entire military doctrine around this ancient, tested truth. They sat inside reinforced caves carved into Yemen's mountains, 100-200 miles from their nearest target, and believed that distance was armor. They controlled the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, an 18-mile-wide choke point through which a staggering percentage of global energy trade must pass. They believed this gave them leverage over the entire world economy. They announced a blockade on Red Sea shipping. They fired on commercial vessels. They launched missiles and drones in what they described as a campaign of resistance that would force the world to acknowledge their power. Every single act of aggression was broadcast on their own media channels as proof of their growing military capability. On March 28, 2026, the kill web's response made every one of those claims irrelevant, not through a single dramatic strike, but through something far more humiliating: indifference. Red Sea shipping did not stop. Energy prices did not spike. Global supply chains did not shudder. International cargo vessels continued transiting the Bab el-Mandeb as though the Houthi threat simply did not exist. Because to the kill web, the 1,200 miles of desert between Yemen and Israel is not a barrier. It is an 18-minute flight time on a targeting computer. Every cave is a GPS coordinate waiting for an assignment. Every launch crew is a heat signature already in a track file, and every missile fired is another data point feeding a system that uses it to build a more complete picture of everything its enemy is trying to hide. What comes after? The 40-year military investment of the Axis of Resistance, Iran's ballistic missile stockpiles, Hezbollah's rocket arsenal, the Houthi drone and missile program, was tested in a single morning against an integrated defense architecture that had spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario. The US contributed over 150 THAAD interceptors and 80 SM-3 interceptors in defense operations since the conflict began in late February 2026 alone. The results were not a tactical setback for Iran and its proxies. They were a strategic revelation, a moment that exposed with brutal clarity the gap between what these forces believed they were capable of and what the kill web allowed them to actually achieve. The one Iranian missile that slipped through the layered defenses and struck Ramat Gan was a tragedy, One person was killed, one residential building became a monument to the terrifying limits of even the best defense systems. No shield in history has ever been perfect, and no military planner on either side would pretend otherwise. But that single impact, among hundreds of intercepted threats, was immediately reverse traced to its launch point, and that launch point was subsequently destroyed. The enemy paid a devastating asymmetric price for every round it fired. The question that every military analyst, every geopolitical strategist, and every nation-state currently watching this conflict should be sitting with right now is not whether the kill web worked. That question has already been answered. The real question is what comes next for the adversaries who just had their strategic doctrine shattered in 94 seconds. Iran still has capabilities, the Houthis still control terrain, Hezbollah still exists as a fighting force. But all three of them now know something they didn't know before March 28, 2026. That every missile they fire is a confession, every drone they launch is a coordinate, and every moment they act is another thread of data feeding the invisible spider sitting at the center of its web. The kill web did not just win a battle that morning, it sent a message to every military command on Earth that is still writing doctrine based on the old rules of geography, volume of fire, and attrition economics. Those rules are gone, and the world that replaces them is already here, whether the axis of resistance is ready to accept that or not. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think Iran's next move looks like? What does this mean for global shipping, for energy prices, for the millions of civilians caught in the middle of a conflict that powerful systems fight but ordinary people endure? Share this video with someone who needs the full picture, because the headlines will never give it to them.